Today we're doing lesson 2.14. That's module 2, lesson 14. And we're adding on to what we learned yesterday. Okay, so your learning goal looks relatively the same, right? And your learning goal is to be able to use what you know about multiplication to convert units of measurement. But let's start by talking about our problem of the day. Today for the problem of the day, as you can see, it says there's no need to write out what the question's asking, the important information, all that. You're just going to go ahead and answer the questions. The questions tell you to draw and label a tape diagram to show each of the following. So for example, one student is what fraction of our class? Well, it's 1 out of 30, because how many kids do we have all together? 30. So in my tape diagram, I drew that the whole piece of tape is room 30, and I divided it into room 50, and I divided it into 30 equal size sections because there's 30 students. And one of those sections, one student, is 1 out of how many sections altogether? 30. So what fraction is one student out of our whole class? 1/30th of our whole class. So by drawing this tape diagram, we can see that one day is 1/7 of a week. If I say, hey, this week for 1/7 of the week, we are going to not have any homework. How many days would we not have any homework? One. Okay, so would you say that those two units of measurement are the exact same? Are they equivalent? Is 1/7 of a week equivalent to 1 day? Yeah. Good. Now let's try quarts and gallons. If we know that there's 4 quarts in 1 gallon, 1 quart is what fraction of the gallon? 1/4, right? So 1/4 of a gallon is equal to 1 quart, right? Because each of these is 1 quart, and when I put 4 of them together, it turns into 1 gallon. But if I only have 1 quart, it's only 1/4 of the entire gallon. Do you see that? Yeah. So again, these are equivalent measurements. 1/4 gallon is the same thing as 1 quart. If I told Grishma to give me 1/4 of a gallon of chocolate syrup, and I told Emily to give me 1 quart of chocolate syrup, who's giving me more chocolate syrup? None. They're giving me the same amount. Very good. Now let's try number 3. How many centimeters can I fit inside this meter? 100. So I'm going to draw. Obviously, I'm not going to draw 100 of them, but I'm going to do this. Okay, I'm going to show that this is my first centimeter, my second centimeter, my third, all the way until 97 or 98, 99, and 100. So if I only have 1 centimeter, that's 1 slice out of how many total slices? 100. So 1/100th of a meter is the same as 1 centimeter. Again, those are two equivalent measurements. So if I tell you to give me 1 centimeter, but I want you to express it in terms of meters, how many meters is it? 1/100th. Do you see how it's just 1 centimeter is just a fraction of the entire meter? Yeah. Good. This is something we learned in 4th grade, multiplying a whole number by a fraction. If I have let me ask you a question. If I have 4 times books, how many books do I have? 4 books, right? If I have 4 copies of Haley, how many Haleys do I have? 4 Haleys. If I have 4 copies of the number 2, how many number 2s do I have? 8. Wait, how many number 2s do I have? 8. If I have 4 copies of the number 2, how many 2s do I have? 8. I have 8 2s? I have 4 2s, but the value is 8. If I have 4 copies of 1/2, how many halves do I have? 4 halves, right? So 4 times 1/2 is 4 halves, which we can simplify to be 2. If I have 56 copies of 1/8, how many eighths do I have? 56 eighths. So that's the same as 56 eighths. Do you agree? Yeah. Can I simplify that? Yeah. What is 56 eighths? 7. Good. If I have 1,200 copies of 1/12, how many 12ths do we have? 1,200 12ths. And I could write that like this, 1,200 12ths. And by the way, if I simplify that, that equals 100. Let's review what we know about metric units. Do you guys remember how King Henry died unusually drinking chocolate milk? That's how we remember the different prefixes. Now, let me ask you a question. Is this for metric units or customary units? Metric, okay. So if I zoom in and I look at the unusually part, the U stands for the basic unit, okay. And we can see that there's 3 basic units for metric units. There's meter, which is what we use to measure length, liters, which is what we use to measure volume, and there's grams, which is what we use to measure weight, okay. Now, we add prefixes, short parts of words, before that meter, liter, or gram to make it bigger or smaller, right? And the main ones you need to know are the ones I've written here, okay? The K in king stands for kilo. So if there's kilo, that means 1,000 of the regular units. So is a kilometer bigger or a meter bigger? Kilometer. How many times bigger is it? 1,000. So express 1 gram as a fraction of a kilogram. 1 gram is it going to be bigger or smaller than a kilogram? Smaller. How much smaller? 1,000. So 1 gram is what fraction of a kilogram? 1/1,000. Do you see how that works? Okay. Don't worry about the ones I didn't, like these ones that I didn't highlight. Now the red ones, are these bigger or smaller than the units? Smaller. Okay. So centiliter, is that smaller or bigger than a liter? Smaller. So express 1 centiliter as a fraction of a liter. It's going to be 1/100th of the liter. Does that make sense? Okay. And then the M for milk, milli, that's even smaller. How many times is a millimeter smaller than a centimeter? 10 times. So express 1 millimeter as a fraction of a centimeter. 1 millimeter is 1/10 of a centimeter. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Okay, if the problem's asking us to convert from days to weeks, let me just ask you a question. Are we converting from a smaller unit to a bigger unit or a bigger unit to a smaller unit? Because 1 day is shorter than 1 week, so we're going from a smaller to a bigger. So let me ask you a question. If I have 1 day, will I have 1 week or less than 1 week? Less, right? If I have 42 days, will I have 42 weeks or less than 42 weeks? Because it's not possible for 42 days to also be 42 weeks. It's going to be less than 42 weeks. Do you agree? Yeah. Okay, so we got to think about these things in our head so that we know if our answers are reasonable or not. Just like yesterday, we're going to follow the same steps. We know that 42 days is the same thing as 42 copies of 1 day. Yes? Yeah. Okay. Now our next step. That's 42 copies of, in the parentheses, we want them to be equivalent. Okay, so I have 1 day here. So 1 day is how many weeks? 1/7 of a week. Do you see how the things inside the parentheses are equivalent or the same? Okay, so then now I just multiply. 42 times 1/7 is 42 sevenths. And I can simplify that fraction because I know if I have 42, it goes into 7 how many times? 6. So therefore, 42 days is the same as 6 weeks. Okay, now if it tells us to convert centimeters to meters, okay, let me just ask you a question. Are we converting from a smaller unit to a bigger unit or a bigger unit to a smaller unit? Because a centimeter is this big and a meter is this big. So if I have 760 centimeters, will I also have 760 meters? I'm going to have way less, right? Okay, so let's follow the same steps. I know that 760 centimeters is 760 copies of how many centimeters? 1 centimeter. Again, you remember you do this by writing how many copies, and then you do 1 of the unit. Okay, you always keep the units the same first. Then for the second step, we still have 760 copies, but this time I want to write the new unit, which is what? Meters. So I want what's inside my parentheses to be equivalent. So 1 centimeter is the same as how many meters? 1/100th. Very good. Okay. Now I can multiply. 760 hundredths is the same thing as 760 over 100. Yes? Okay. Oh, don't forget to write your unit. I almost forgot. What's my new unit? Meters. If you don't write the unit, we won't know what you're talking about. Now to simplify this is the same thing as 760 divided by 100, right? So what is that? If I have 760, do I have to write it in standard algorithm? No. No, because if I have 760, here's the decimal point. When I divide by 100, what happens to the decimal point? Good. So the answer is